of people out there wonder, why does it feel like my parents hate me? And there are a lot of different reasons why it might feel that way. Small behaviors that their parents take part in that lead them to feel like they hate them. Without further ado, let's get into those reasons. A common reason why sometimes parents make their kids feel like they hate them is they project all of their undesired qualities onto their child. In psychology, there's a defense mechanism called projection, which is where you take something that you hate about yourself, like let's say being morally self-righteous, and you project it onto somebody other than yourself. It's basically like saying, I'm not morally self-righteous, you are. So for example, if a parent is highly morally self-righteous and they're not aware of it on a conscious level, and they hate that about themselves, then they might see their child, who is the perfect target to project onto, because children have less power and they're easily moldable and they are often receptive to what their parents, who are in a position of power over them, have to say about different things. And so they'll accuse their child of being morally self-righteous when they're standing up for themselves against an injustice, when really the parent is the one who's usually morally self-righteous. Another defense that's related to this is called projective identification, which is when the parent will make their child feel the way that they feel in the moment. So if, for example, they feel rejected by their child because their child wanted to go to a sleepover, they're then going to reject their child so that the child feels rejected just as they do. Again, they are incapable of holding their own emotional experience, so they offload it onto somebody who's unfortunately an easier target. And sometimes kids copy behaviors that they see in their parents, even like the way that they talk or like mannerisms or the way that they laugh, sometimes even the way that they sneeze. And so when a child is doing that, and let's say they make a slightly mean joke and the parent hears that and they see themselves in that behavior unconsciously, but it's too painful to look it in the face and say, hey, I sometimes make mean jokes. They condemn their child and they say, what a horrible, horrible person you are to say something like that. A lot of parents who moralize, who tell their kids you are morally bad for XYZ reason, they are doing the very things that they're criticizing their child of. There are a lot of people out there who wonder if they're fundamentally a bad person, or if they have a personality disorder, or if they're faking their empathy, or if they're one day going to get exposed for being a fraud in some way. The people that are wondering that about themselves, it's not always the case, but usually they're not the ones who should be worried about that. In a lot of cases, their parents made them feel that way because those were things the parents should have been wondering about themselves. And then this child grows up to become an adult who has this core belief about themselves that they are a terrible person because their parent couldn't hold their own painful experiences. Number 2, parents make their child feel like they hate them when they treat them like a punching bag for emotional catharsis. When a parent comes home from work and they have whatever issues with their boss or their coworkers and they displace that anger onto the child, they're sending the message, you exist as a punching bag for whatever else upsets me in the world. In such families, there's often this expectation that the person with the least amount of power will always be there to sort of absorb whatever painful emotions or aggression the other family members have. Sometimes that will be like the scapegoat of the family. Sometimes it will be the only child of a family. Sometimes it's all children that are expected to shoulder that burden. Regardless, the target of this emotional catharsis, it is assumed that they're never going to stand up for themselves. And if that child then grows up, becomes an adult who does start to stand up for themselves, who says, actually, no, I'm done with the way you treat me, the person who's no longer able to treat them as a punching bag and anyone who's enabled them in that family system is going to have a real problem with that. And they're going to treat the child as the source of the problem rather than the person who is actually mistreating them this whole time, which further reinforces that core belief of, oh my God, I'm a terrible person. Everybody hates me. Up next, I'm going to show you how parents make their children feel morally inferior just for doing age-appropriate behaviors. But first, a word from today's sponsor, Incogni. Now that I live in a country that actually keeps its residents' information safe, I keep thinking about how insane it is that I used to live somewhere where that wasn't the case, where everyone's private information can pretty much be found on the internet. In the United States, it's pretty easy to find somebody's date of birth, home address, email address, family members on like people search websites. That's because data brokers aggregate your personal information and sell it to businesses and scammers, which, as you can imagine, is super dangerous. It sets you up for identity theft, harassment, stalking, scams. Every time you get a notification that your information has been found on the black market, that's usually what that's referring to. So Incogni tries to solve all of these problems. It would take years for you to reach out to all of these websites and ask them to take down your information, so Incogni does all the hard part for you. All you have to do is create an account, grant them the right to contact these data brokers on your behalf, and then they pester these people over and over again until they take down your information, and they make sure it stays down as well. So if it ever reappears, they will handle that as well. As you already know, I myself have been using Incogni for years, and it's just an easy way to help you sleep better at night. Use the link below to get 60% off your annual Incogni plan. That's incogni.com/DRANA. Use the promo code DRANA. Thank you so much to Incogni, and back to the video. Another reason why sometimes parents make their children feel like they hate them is they pathologize very developmentally normal behaviors. Like, it drives me up a fucking wall when people try to act like babies are manipulative just because they sometimes cry when they don't like something, or sometimes they'll set a boundary and then people will be like, oh, they like trained you. No, they're just human beings with needs who, yeah, sometimes express those needs and sometimes have big feelings. Or when people act like toddlers are trying to give them a hard time when really they're just having a hard time and need help regulating their emotions. Or when they treat age-appropriate crushes as something like sexually impure that must be aggressively shamed away. Or when they pathologize normal adolescent and teenager behavior, like not really caring what their parents have to say, learning independence, experimenting with their identity, caring about peer acceptance. All of these things can sometimes be framed as a teenager being problematic or explosive or rebellious, when really they're just being an average teenager, completely normal when you consider what's going on in their head and their body at that time. Or people who pathologize young adults who start to individuate and start to want to do things differently from their parents or take a different path than what their parents hoped for them, and they frame that as a problem. None of these things are abnormal or pathological, but a parent who is determined to view their child in a negative light will frame these very developmentally appropriate behaviors as problematic. And they might sometimes even take them to doctors and say, tell me what's wrong with my child. You know, do they have intermittent explosive disorder? Or do they have oppositional defiant disorder? And it's like, none of that. They're a normal person. And sometimes even the most insightful adults will not even realize, even as adults, how much they absorbed this messaging. They just have this like recurrent belief that I'm a bad person because their parents said they were a bad person at different stages in their life, when really they've been carrying this shame this whole time, and all they ever were was just a normal kid. Number 4, sometimes parents really envy their child, and that becomes apparent. This is common in parents who are either physically neglected and or physically abused by their own parents, where they start to resent their child for having all their physical needs met and often not their emotional needs met, or for only experiencing emotional abuse at their hands. Or they might resent a child for having more resources than they did growing up, or for living in a time period when kids are given more rights and their feelings are considered more. Or they will envy a child for being young or being beautiful or getting attention and love from their partner. But instead of turning towards their own grief and attending to those feelings of loss about what they could have had, what they should have had, they lash out with this angry type of envy at their child. And it can be very strange to be on the receiving end of envy, because if you're a person that's very grateful, it's really uncomfortable. It's like, yeah, I'm very lucky to have the things that I'm grateful for. Why are you trying to make me feel guilty about that? Another reason why it might feel like your parents hate you is if they have this expectation or had this expectation that you would fulfill their unmet needs. Like those parents who have a kid in order to save a marriage or to make them feel wanted in a way that no one ever did before. There's kind of this assumption that because kids are so innocent and loving and pure, that they're always going to love and validate and need you. And in reality, having kids can be very humbling, because even babies who are incredibly needy are not always always going to validate you and are sometimes going to make you feel like nothing I ever do is enough. You're certainly not going to get all your needs met from a tiny human who doesn't even know how to hold their head up yet. And certainly not as they grow up and start to talk back and say no to things and have boundaries and needs of their own that sometimes might clash with yours. So if a parent has a child with the intention of receiving rather than they have a child with the intention of giving to that child, they're going to be sorely disappointed. There's going to be this gaping hole between what they expected would happen and the reality of the situation. And that disappointment, if left unchecked and unregulated, can turn into really ugly resentment that kids do pick up on. So in conclusion, if you've ever wondered, why does it feel like my parents hate me? Here are 5 possible reasons. If they projected their undesired traits onto you, if they treated you like a punching bag, if they pathologized developmentally normal behavior, if they envied you, or if they had an expectation that you would fulfill all their needs and it turned out that that wasn't possible. As always, the thing that I most love about making these videos is hearing the way that you guys relate to them and how your personal experiences tie into this topic. I hope that this video was helpful, and I'll see you soon.
Tell me what you